Imagine this. You wake up one day, and the world feels different. Not calmer, not safer, just quieter. No fear, no shame, no urgency to prove yourself, chase someone's approval, or avoid someone's judgment. You move through the world with a kind of stillness, like your inner storm has been turned off. People speak and you listen, but their words don't pierce you. They bounce, softly, powerlessly. Not because you've become cold, but because something inside you finally changed. The thing that used to flinch, the thing that used to ache, it's gone. It's as if somehow nothing and nobody can hurt you anymore. But not because the world has changed, because you have. That is the state Carl Jung pointed to. Not directly, not with instruction manuals or easy affirmations, but through his shadowy journey into the soul, a place beyond emotional slavery, beyond the ego's obsession with being liked, needed, validated, beyond the pain of rejection, humiliation, abandonment, where power isn't something you earn, but something you remember. But here's the twist. We live in a culture that tells you to get stronger by becoming more attractive, more successful, more confident. And yet, paradoxically, the more you become, the more vulnerable you often feel. The richer you are, the more afraid you are of losing it. The more admired you are, the more terrified you are of fading. The more loved you are, the more anxious you become about being replaced. So what if strength, real, indestructible strength, isn't about becoming more? What if it's about confronting the terrifying possibility that you don't need to be anything to be beyond harm? What if the key to never being hurt again isn't armor, isn't strategy, isn't control, but something deeper, something forgotten, something Jung believed we had buried beneath centuries of conditioning, trauma, and false identities? But let's go even darker for a second. Have you ever noticed how much of your life is secretly structured around avoiding pain? The way you withhold your truth because you're afraid it'll push people away. The way you edit your personality in social settings to stay likable. The way you overthink every decision, not because it's right or wrong, but because you're terrified of regret, failure, humiliation. That's not living. That's rehearsing for survival. It's a performance of self, curated to not be punished. Now ask yourself, who exactly are you performing for? And what's the real cost of staying that safe? Because here's the hidden horror. If you live your entire life avoiding pain, you never discover the you who can't be hurt. You never meet the self, capital S, that Jung spoke of, the deeper you, the invincible you, the you that stands on the other side of your childhood wounds, your abandonment patterns, your shattered illusions, and still breathes. Not because it's untouchable by the world, but because it no longer needs the world to touch it in the first place. So the question is not, how do I protect myself from pain? The real question is, who would I be if I stopped believing pain could take anything away from me? Not numb, not detached, not indifferent, but free. What if nothing anyone ever says or does can actually define your worth again? What if no loss can destroy you because you've realized nothing outside you ever completed you to begin with? What if love, power, peace aren't things you earn, win, or steal, but return to once you stop clinging to what you're not? This is the essence of Jung's work. Not self-improvement, but self-reintegration. Not pretending you're strong, but remembering that your wounds never had the final word on who you are. To reach that state, you don't just change your thinking. You descend into the shadow, into the pain, into the parts of yourself you were told to hate, hide, and silence. Because on the other side of that descent, something waits for you, something timeless, silent, unbothered, unhurt, the part of you that nothing and nobody can ever touch. And when you return from that place, you don't need armor. You are the storm. Here's the cruel irony. The very things you think are protecting you are the exact things keeping you in pain. Your perfectionism? It doesn't protect you from shame, it feeds it. Your people-pleasing? It doesn't bring you love, it trades your identity for momentary approval. Your self-control? It isn't strength, it's fear dressed in discipline's clothing. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to function in society, not because we're evil, but because we were trained, often from childhood, to believe that who we really are isn't good enough, safe enough, or lovable enough. So we split. We become two. The outer self, polished, polite, agreeable, and the shadow, the disowned parts, buried in silence. The anger, the jealousy, the insecurity, the chaos, the truth. You were told to suppress those parts, but Jung warned, anything you bury in the unconscious doesn't disappear. It waits, and it controls you from the dark. Let's pause here and get painfully honest. Why do certain people still have the power to break you? Why do a few words from your partner, your boss, your parent feel like emotional execution? It's not because of what they said. It's because they unknowingly touched a wound you've never fully looked at. It's not about the moment, it's about the history. When someone ignores you and it shatters your peace, it's not the present rejection that hurts. It's the old abandonment it reactivates. When someone criticizes you and you spiral, it's not about their opinion. It's about the voice inside you that's been saying the same thing for years. And as long as that voice lives inside you unchecked, you'll keep outsourcing your worth to external validation. And you'll keep being hurt over and over by people who are simply mirroring your own self-rejection back at you. This is the hidden problem. You're trying to protect a false self from injury, when it's the false self that keeps you injured. You build your identity on things that are inherently unstable. Status, attractiveness, niceness, performance. And deep down, you know it. That's why you're anxious. That's why you rehearse every interaction, anticipate rejection, obsess over your image. Because your value is tied to conditions you can't always control. So your worth becomes like a house of glass, beautiful, fragile, and always in danger of shattering. Carl Jung wasn't the only one to see this. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of a similar danger. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he spoke of the last man, the human being who avoids all pain, risk, and struggle. In exchange for comfort and social approval, he is not free. He is not alive. He is just surviving. And many of us are doing exactly that. Modern society tells you, stay safe, stay neutral, stay nice, hide your intensity, downplay your hunger, soften your truth. But Jung believed the soul demands wholeness, not goodness. And if you deny parts of yourself to be accepted, you're not healed, you're just tamed. Let's go even deeper. The human psyche, according to Jung, is made of opposites, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow. But most people are at war with one half of themselves. They want to be happy but reject their sadness. They want to be wise but deny their confusion. They want to be strong but hate their vulnerability. And this internal war creates a kind of psychic tension. You're never fully at peace because your soul is calling you toward integration, and your ego is pulling you toward image management. That's why you feel split. That's why you never feel enough, no matter how much you accomplish. You're not weak. You're divided. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. You can't find your true self through the ego, because the ego is built on separation, from others, from pain, from the shadow. But Jung's psychology was not about eliminating the ego. It was about transcending its illusion of control. He believed that true healing begins the moment you stop trying to be good and start becoming whole, not perfect, not polished, but radically integrated, which means you stop performing for love, you stop hiding your chaos, you stop pretending to be unbreakable, and paradoxically, that's when you become truly unbreakable. Because now no one can threaten to expose you. You've already exposed yourself to yourself. No one can shame you. You've already held your darkness with dignity. No one can reject you. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You've already chosen all of yourself. So why don't most people get here? Because it's terrifying. There's a deep fear in all of us. If I stopped pretending, would anyone stay? And that fear keeps us performing, smiling when we're dying inside, saying I'm fine when our world is falling apart. But what Jung knew, what few are willing to accept, is that the path to liberation always passes through the shadow. You have to confront your rage, your shame, your manipulation, your helplessness, your cruelty, your loneliness, not to destroy them, but to reclaim them, to understand them as parts of a whole, not threats to your worth. The deeper truth, you've been carrying a wound that isn't even yours. Most of the pain you're trying to heal was inherited from a culture that profits from your insecurity, parents who hadn't healed themselves, in a world terrified of authentic emotion. And now, you're here, on the edge of something ancient, not a technique, not a mindset, but a return to the self that was never broken, just buried, to the you that doesn't need defending, because nothing real in you can ever be harmed. the unseen consequences. Let's talk about what happens when you don't go into the shadow, when you don't do the work, when you stay safe, polished, pleasing, disconnected from the parts of yourself you were told to bury. At first, nothing looks wrong. You're functional, you smile, you achieve, you might even be admired, but quietly, invisibly, something starts to rot. It's slow, subtle, a kind of spiritual erosion. The soul doesn't scream, it whispers. You'll feel it when you're alone. That strange emptiness, not sadness, not despair, just numbness. Like you're alive but not inhabiting your own life. And here's the terrifying part. That numbness isn't the absence of feeling, it's the consequence of suppression. Carl Jung called it psychic inflation, when you become so identified with the mask, the persona, that you forget there's even something beneath it. You think, I'm just an anxious person, or I'm just a people pleaser, or I'm just not the kind of person who speaks up. But those aren't truths. They're adaptations. Defense mechanisms you built to survive environments where your real self wasn't welcome. And over time, these adaptations solidify. They become your personality, and your personality becomes your prison. Here's the hidden cost of avoiding the shadow. 1. You become emotionally dependent on others for your identity. Because your self-worth isn't rooted in wholeness, you outsource it. A text reply determines your value. A raised eyebrow triggers a spiral. You spend your days scanning rooms for approval and disapproval, as if your life depends on it, because psychologically, it does. 2. You attract relationships that mirror your fragmentation. The more disconnected you are from your own needs, desires, and anger, the more you unconsciously choose people who trigger those exact wounds. Not because you're broken, but because your unconscious wants resolution. It wants to relive the trauma in hopes of rewriting the ending. But without self-awareness, it becomes a loop. Same pain, different faces. 3. You mistake performance for power. You think dominance means control, charisma means safety. But true power doesn't come from being in control, it comes from not needing control. You'll notice this when things go wrong. When someone rejects you, criticizes you, disrespects you, and your entire sense of self collapses. Why? Because the person you thought you were was never real. It was a performance held together by applause. Let's zoom out. On a societal level, the consequences are just as severe. We live in a culture of masks. Influencer culture thrives not because people are free, but because they're desperate to be seen, to be validated as enough by strangers on screens. Therapy isn't taboo anymore, but healing often is. Because real healing isn't sexy. It's messy, ugly, lonely. It doesn't happen in 10 steps. It doesn't look good on Instagram. And it threatens the very systems, corporate, romantic, religious, that profit from your emptiness. We say we want love, but most people want familiarity. And if chaos is familiar, they'll chase it. If rejection is familiar, they'll seek it. If self-abandonment is familiar, they'll mistake it for loyalty. This is the tragedy of the unexamined shadow. You don't just suffer. You recreate the suffering over and over and call it fate. Let's bring it closer. Have you ever felt an irrational fear of being too much? A constant need to prove your worth in every interaction? A deep guilt anytime you prioritize yourself? A quiet resentment toward people who seem free while you're still stuck? These aren't random neuroses, they're signals. Your unconscious is trying to speak, not with words but with patterns. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So many people are fighting demons that don't even belong to them. Inherited shame, cultural guilt, religious programming, generational trauma, and they keep losing, not because they're weak, but because they don't even realize who the enemy is. And then there's the worst consequence of all. You forget what it feels like to be real. You forget the taste of your own truth. You forget how it feels to say no and mean it. To want something deeply and admit it without shame. To sit in silence without trying to fix, solve, or shrink yourself for anyone else's comfort. You become a ghost inside your own life. Visible, functional, but emotionally dead. And no achievement, no lover, no amount of spiritual bypassing will fill that void. Because the void isn't out there. It's the space where your real self used to live. So where does this all point? To one critical realization: if you don't do the shadow work, your life becomes a repetition of unhealed wounds, not because you deserve to suffer, but because your soul refuses to let you stay asleep. Pain isn't punishment. It's invitation. Your triggers aren't flaws, they're flashlights. The question is, are you willing to follow where they lead? Because the longer you avoid the descent, the more distorted your ascent becomes, and the longer you deny your truth, the more power you give to those who benefit from your silence. There is no such thing as nothing can hurt you again, until you confront the parts of you that believe you're still breakable. You don't become untouchable by avoiding pain. You become untouchable by integrating the part of you that can hold pain without becoming it. And that changes everything. The rebellion, how to break free. It begins quietly, not with fire, not with rage, but with a question. What if I stopped pretending? That question is a rebellion, a sacred defiance against the lie you've been living. And it doesn't require a grand announcement, just one terrifying decision to face yourself completely. Because healing doesn't begin with answers. It begins with honesty. When you finally admit, I'm exhausted from performing, I'm tired of hiding my anger behind a smile. I'm tired of measuring my worth in reactions. I'm tired of shaping myself to be chosen while forgetting I can choose too. That moment, that's the beginning of freedom. But don't mistake this for a self-help fairy tale. This isn't a 5-step glow-up. This is psychological war between the self you buried and the self you built to survive. You will not win by being kinder. You will win by being braver. Because to break free, you have to do what most never dare to do. Walk willingly into your own shadow, not to conquer it, but to recognize it as you. Carl Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So you start with the parts you swore you'd never touch. The jealousy, the control, the guilt you carry for wanting more than survival, the grief you never allowed yourself to feel because it would have broken you. You sit with them, not to judge, but to listen. Because every one of those emotions is a fragment of you, a version of you that was once too overwhelmed, too silenced, too dismissed. And when you witness them without shame, they start to alchemize. They stop controlling you because they're no longer strangers. They're homecoming signals. Next comes the unlearning. Everything you were taught about being good, normal, safe, you now hold up to the light. You stop asking, how can I be accepted? And start asking, they're accepted by who? For what? At what cost? You begin to see that most of what passed for love in your life was actually transaction. Approval in exchange for obedience. Praise in exchange for performance. Connection in exchange for self-abandonment. That's not love. That's emotional politics. And you decide you will no longer trade your authenticity for peace. Because that kind of peace is prison with soft lighting. You start saying no, not loudly, but clearly. You no longer explain yourself to people who benefit from your confusion. You no longer participate in conversations that require you to shrink. You no longer chase people who punish your honesty. And when your hands shake, you breathe through it. That trembling, it's not weakness. It's the sound of a cage unlocking. Here's the thing no one tells you about freedom. It's lonely at first. Because when you stop playing the role everyone's comfortable with, they'll get uncomfortable. They'll say, you've changed. You're selfish. You're too intense. Let them. They're not speaking about you. They're speaking about their lost control over you. And you keep walking. You stop looking for mirrors in other people and you start becoming one. A mirror of clarity, a mirror of boundary, a mirror of permission, not to conform, but to expand. You become dangerous, not in a violent sense, but in the way that silence becomes dangerous to a lie. You become the person who can sit in a room and see through performance, through manipulation, through projection. Because you've done that work internally. You no longer flinch when someone doesn't like you. You no longer abandon yourself to be liked. You've tasted truth, and truth, once tasted, makes illusions unbearable. Viktor Frankl once said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." But attitude isn't surface. Attitude is rooted in self-permission. And you now give yourself permission to live as if nothing is missing, because nothing essential ever was. You weren't broken, you were buried. You weren't too much, you were in the wrong rooms. You weren't hard to love, you were surrounded by people who only know how to love versions of themselves. So you return to your weirdness, to your fire, to your contradictions, to your you-ness. You return not to prove, but to embody. And finally, you realize the old question was flawed all along. You spent your life asking, how do I stop people from hurting me? But the real question is, on how do I become someone who can't be hurt by lies about who I am? You don't need armor, you need truth, because truth is not a weapon, it's a mirror that makes the weapon irrelevant. And when you live in truth, you don't become invincible, you become undeniable. The ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. Imagine standing at the edge of your own life and realizing you were never broken, you were never weak, you were never unworthy of love. You were simply misled into believing that your strength would come from what you could gather, perform, fix, or become. That if you could just be better, you'd finally be untouchable. But the truth, the final, most radical truth, you don't become unbreakable by becoming more. You become unbreakable when you stop trying to become anything at all. Because who you really are beneath the scripts, beneath the trauma, beneath the survival strategies, was never wounded to begin with. Carl Jung didn't teach us how to build ourselves, he taught us how to remember ourselves. The self, in Jungian terms, isn't the ego you polish for the world, it's the totality of you. The wild, the wise, the primal, the divine, the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the shadow. It is not something you earn, it's something you reclaim. And once you touch that place, once you stand in it, you no longer beg the world for permission to exist. You no longer shapeshift to survive love. You no longer defend wounds you've already integrated. You stop being someone who needs to be safe, because you've realized the only thing that could ever hurt you was your own illusion. The illusion that said, I need their approval to feel worthy. I need success to feel real. I need to be loved to be whole. But once those illusions fall, you experience something people rarely talk about: peace without dependence. Not the peace that comes from everything going right, but the peace that comes from no longer fearing when things go wrong. Not because you're numb, not because you're invulnerable, but because you know who you are and no one can take that from you. This is the kind of power that terrifies systems. It doesn't shout, it doesn't beg, it simply exists, fully. But let's be clear, this realization doesn't make you better, it makes you real. You still feel grief, you still feel anger, you still cry when things end, but now, those emotions don't define you. They move through you like weather. You no longer get stuck in the storm because you've remembered you are not the storm. You are the sky it passes through. So what happens next? You stop performing. You speak with clarity, not for validation, but for alignment. You set boundaries, not to control others, but to protect your center. You love fully, not to be chosen, but because you choose. And suddenly the fear that used to run your life, the fear of being rejected, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being alone, it all quiets down because you are no longer negotiating your existence with people who don't even know who they are. You've come home. Here's the paradox. You think your life is about getting somewhere, becoming something, earning some kind of divine approval. But the final realization? You were never on a path to become worthy. You were on a path to remember you always were. The journey wasn't upward, it was inward. The liberation wasn't in arrival, it was in removal of lies, of shame, of everything you were taught to believe about yourself from people who never met your soul. And when you finally shed those layers, there's a silence that arrives. Not emptiness, but stillness, not numbness, but presence. And from that place you can finally see the world clearly. Not through the lens of fear, not through the lens of old stories, but through your own eyes, clear, unfiltered, awake. And what you see is power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to no longer be dominated by illusion. This is the power that says, I will not abandon myself even if everyone else does. I will not shrink to be palatable. I will not armor my heart to avoid loss. I will feel fully and remain whole. You've stepped into your shadow. You've faced what terrified you. You've grieved what you never got. You've held yourself in the silence that used to drown you. And now, nothing and nobody can ever hurt you again. Not because they won't try, but because there's nothing left to shatter. The self is intact. The soul is sovereign. And you are finally free. So now ask yourself, what are you still protecting? What mask are you still wearing for a world that forgot its own face? What truth are you still withholding from yourself? Because behind every fear you carry, is a truth that will set you free. And behind every truth is the self you've always been watching, waiting, ready to return. You don't need to be more. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to stop pretending you're not already whole. And once you do, no relationship, no loss, no rejection, no opinion will ever have the power to hurt you again. Because the real you, the one beneath it all, was never broken, only buried. Now it's time to rise.
These two videos on your screen aren't random. The divine guides them. Click to watch both. They hold something special for you.